It was the early 1990s and the Czech Republic was still young, born from the Velvet Revolution, finding its balance after decades of communism. Freedom filled the air, fortunes could be made overnight, and the streets of Prague were crowded with new businesses, flashy cars, and men who seemed to rise from nothing to millionaires in months. Privatization created sudden winners and losers. The black market grew, and foreign cars lined the streets while greed and envy spread through society. But freedom also meant chaos. Laws were weak, the police inexperienced, and organized crime flourished in the shadows. The old communist structures of power had collapsed, but nothing strong had replaced them yet. It was an age of ambition, but also of betrayal. Among those who tried to seize the opportunity were Vladimír Kuna, Petr Chodounský, Ludvík Černý, and Karel Kopáč. Outwardly, they were neighbors, acquaintances, and businessmen, but inside they were drowning in debts, greed, and desperation. They needed money, power, and protection. And soon, they gathered into a group that would write one of the darkest chapters in Czech criminal history. At first, their operations were small. They lent money at high interest, pressured debtors, and played the role of tough businessmen. They met in smoky pubs, planned in cheap offices, and strutted through the streets like local bosses. But the 1990s were unforgiving. Debts grew, enemies multiplied, and soon they turned to murder as a tool of business. Their method was as simple as it was horrifying. The victim would be lured into a meeting with promises of settling debts or making deals. Once alone, he would be overpowered, sometimes drugged, sometimes shot. His body would be stuffed into a large steel barrel, into which they poured lye to dissolve flesh and destroy evidence. The barrel was sealed, chained, and driven under cover of night to the Orlík Reservoir. There it would be rolled into the black water and sink into silence. Between 1991 and 1993, at least 5 men were killed this way. The first was Aleš, a businessman who had borrowed heavily. He vanished one evening, his car later abandoned. His wife filed a missing person report and pleaded for help, but the case went nowhere. The second victim had ties to real estate and also disappeared without a trace. His brother searched endlessly, visiting pubs, asking questions, convinced he had been betrayed by business partners. The third, Jaroslav, quiet and unthreatening, knew too much about the gang's dealings and paid with his life. His elderly parents waited by the phone for years, hoping for a call that never came. The fourth victim, a currency trader, was lured into a supposed meeting about an investment. He told his girlfriend he would be home by dinner. She never saw him again. His car was later found abandoned, locked, with nothing missing. His family pushed the police for answers, but investigators shrugged. Too many men were vanishing, too many unexplained disappearances. In 1992 alone, hundreds of people were reported missing across the country, many tied to business disputes. For the police, each was just another file in an endless stack. For the families, each was a nightmare. For 2 years, the Orlík Reservoir kept its secrets, but in the summer of 1993, the silence broke. A fisherman near the dam noticed a strange object, a heavy, rusted barrel floating where it should not be. Divers retrieved it, and when police cut it open, the smell was unbearable. Inside lay a decomposed human body, partially dissolved by chemicals, chained and discarded. Soon more barrels were found. Each contained the same gruesome evidence: men murdered, destroyed, and sunk into the lake. The media exploded with headlines about the Orlík barrels. Fear spread quickly. Families who had waited for years finally had answers, but they were devastating. The police launched one of the largest investigations in modern Czech history. Forensic teams struggled with the damaged remains but confirmed identities. Witnesses came forward. One remembered Kuna buying steel barrels under suspicious pretenses. Another had seen nighttime trips to the reservoir. Financial records linked victims to Kuna, Chodounský, Černý, and Kopáč. Piece by piece, the case took shape. The brutality shocked even hardened detectives. This was not a crime of passion, but cold, businesslike calculation. Murder had been industrialized. Police searched warehouses and found chains, chemicals, and tools. They collected receipts for barrels, documents of suspicious loans, and testimonies of people who had seen Kuna, Chodounský, Černý, or Kopáč with the victims. Arrests followed. The accused denied everything, claimed coincidence, insisted they were victims of rumor, but the evidence was too strong, and the net closed around them. The media turned the case into a national obsession. Front pages screamed about the barrels from the reservoir, television showed divers pulling rusted containers from the depths, and the public watched in horror. Parents warned their children not to talk to strangers, business partners looked at each other with suspicion, and people whispered in pubs that anyone could end up in a barrel if they crossed the wrong man. Courtrooms were filled to capacity. Journalists crowded the benches, cameras clicked, sketch artists captured every grimace. The defendants looked ordinary in their suits, which only deepened the horror. Prosecutors laid out the case methodically, showing barrels, presenting forensic testimony, detailing debts and betrayals. Witnesses spoke of barrels purchased, trips made, confessions overheard. Families of victims testified, voices breaking as they described years of uncertainty. Hope turned to despair, the agony of learning their loved ones had been murdered and thrown away like waste. Mothers described sleepless nights, fathers spoke of ruined businesses, children grew up without answers. The defense argued desperately, claiming weak evidence, alternate enemies, planted barrels. They suggested that the victims were criminals themselves, that they could have been killed in unrelated disputes, that the barrels were connected to other gangs. But the chain of proof was overwhelming. Every loan, every meeting, every disappearance led back to the same men. The trial became theater, watched daily by millions. People lined up outside the courthouse just to get a glimpse. True crime magazines published lurid details, some real, some invented. Television debates argued about whether the death penalty should return. Politicians promised reforms. It was as if the entire country was reliving its fragile transition, with the Orlík murders as a symbol of everything that could go wrong when law collapses. The prosecutors showed how carefully the crimes had been planned. They explained how lie was chosen to erase evidence, how barrels were sealed and chained, how night trips to the reservoir were timed to avoid witnesses. Forensic experts described the painstaking process of identifying bodies that had been submerged for years. Each detail horrified the jury and riveted the public. Some of the accused tried to look calm, others showed arrogance, smirking at the cameras. Vladimír Kuna sat stone-faced, as if the trial were beneath him. Petr Chodounský looked broken, eyes cast down. Ludvík Černý, the former policeman, showed no remorse, his expression unreadable, while Karel Kopáč seemed almost detached. But all shared one thing, an absence of regret. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom held its breath. The ringleaders received life sentences, others long prison terms. The judge condemned their inhuman disregard for life, their cold-blooded calculation, their destruction of families and trust. Families wept, some with relief, others with sorrow that no sentence could undo the past. Outside the courthouse, journalists reported every detail. Tabloids speculated about links to politicians, about wider networks of crime, about other bodies never found. Television showed endless footage of barrels being dragged from the water. The public could not look away. For weeks, the Orlík murders dominated every conversation. At bus stops, people argued about whether justice had truly been done. In pubs, men boasted of having known one of the killers or one of the victims. In schools, children repeated rumors, turning horror into playground legend. For the police, the trial was a turning point. They had faced skepticism, ridicule, even threats as they pursued the case. Now their work was vindicated. The Orlík gang had thought their plan perfect, their method foolproof. But the truth had surfaced, literally, from the depths of the reservoir. For journalists, it was a career-defining moment. Some built entire reputations on their coverage. Others were criticized for sensationalism, for turning tragedy into spectacle. Either way, the case proved that crime could no longer be hidden in shadows. From then on, every major crime would be scrutinized, dissected, and judged not just in court, but in the public eye. The Orlík murders became more than just a criminal case. They became a mirror held up to a nation in transition. The Velvet Revolution had promised freedom, But freedom without law bred chaos. The collapse of the old order created space for ambition, but also for cruelty. Ordinary men, neighbors in small towns, men who shook hands in pubs and smiled on the street, had shown that evil did not always look foreign or monstrous. It could look familiar. And that was perhaps the most terrifying revelation. In the years after the trial, the reservoir itself became a place of uneasy memory. Families still came to swim, fishermen still cast their lines, but the stories lingered. Children dared each other to dive near the dam, whispering about barrels still hidden below. Old men at village tables lowered their voices when speaking of Orlík, as if the water itself were listening. For years, rumors persisted that not all the barrels had been found. Divers searched, journalists speculated, families of missing men prayed for answers. Some claimed that as many as a dozen more victims could still lie beneath the surface. Each time the water level dropped, speculation returned. The mystery of what might still rest in the dark depths gave the case an enduring, ghostly presence. For the police, the case forced change. New forensic methods were adopted, databases expanded, cooperation with Interpol strengthened. Officers spoke of the Orlík investigation as a hard lesson, that organized crime was real, that methods could be as gruesome as any seen abroad, and that the young republic needed modern tools to fight them. For journalists, it marked the birth of Czech true crime. From then on, newspapers and television would cover major cases with relentless detail. The public appetite for crime stories grew, sometimes for justice, sometimes for morbid fascination. The Orlík murders were retold in books, documentaries, even dramatizations. They became shorthand for horror, a cultural reference point. In pubs, a bad business partner might be warned half-jokingly not to end up in a barrel. The case entered language itself, a grim metaphor. For the families of the victims, there was no metaphor, only pain. Anniversaries brought flowers to the reservoir, court documents were revisited, and memories reopened. Some family members gave interviews, their voices still breaking decades later. For them, justice was partial. The killers were behind bars, but closure remained impossible. Too much had been stolen, too much destroyed. Sociologists have argued that the case left scars not only on families, but on society. It revealed how fragile trust had become. If neighbors could kill, if businessmen could dissolve bodies in chemicals, then who was safe? It fueled a cynicism that lingered through the decade, a belief that crime always paid, that law was always one step behind. Politicians used the case as proof of the need for stronger policing, for harsher laws, for better oversight. Some used it to justify expanding state power, others to call for moral renewal. In every case, the barrels from Orlík remained the unspoken backdrop, the image that haunted speeches and debates. As the decades passed, the killers aged in prison. Their names faded from headlines, but never vanished entirely. Vladimír Kuna, Petr Chodounský, Ludvík Černý, and Karel Kopáč remained symbols of how far ambition and greed could twist ordinary men. Documentaries revisited the case, using grainy footage of divers, courtroom sketches, and solemn narration. Podcasts in the 21st century brought the story to a new generation. Each retelling emphasized different aspects: the brutality, the context of the 1990s, the failures of police, the resilience of families. Yet all agreed on one thing: the Orlík murders were not just about crime, but about a society learning what freedom without safeguards could unleash. Today, the reservoir is calm again. Boats glide across its surface, children laugh on its shores, tourists photograph its beauty. But those who know the history see more than water. They see a graveyard, a place where greed and cruelty were hidden under the waves. They remember the headlines, the fear, the grief. The Orlík murders are now part of the nation's memory, a story retold not to shock but to warn, to remind that evil can thrive when law is weak, that ambition unchecked can become horror, and that justice, though delayed, must always be pursued. Evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it wears a suit, sometimes it smiles across a table. The men of Orlík showed this truth, and the barrels they sank remained symbols of darkness. Decades later, their story still resonates because it is not only about the past. It is about the fragility of society, the dangers that lurk when freedom is unguarded, and the resilience of those who seek justice against impossible odds. The Orlík murders remain one of the darkest, most unforgettable chapters in Czech history. And as long as the reservoir lies deep and silent, its waters will carry echoes of the crimes that shocked a nation and changed it forever.